751 WIOD from Dade County. In Broward, it's 524 WIOD or 655 WIOD in the Palm Beaches. The opinions expressed by the guest hosts or callers are not necessarily those of the station. Now, Stan Major on News Talk Radio 610 WIOD.
Well, it is indeed an honor and a pleasure to welcome back to the program Mr. Chuck Meyer. We haven't heard from him for about an hour on the news, unless you did the last news.
I did.
You did the last news?
At 7 o'clock.
Oh, no. I mean 8 o'clock.
Oh,
you didn't do the
that was Carrie Moran in Los Angeles.
Oh, wow.
Are we becoming chronic by doing this?
No, we're not.
Good.
Because the last time we did it was like 6 months ago.
Yeah, it's been a while.
It has been a while.
And a lot of people that I encounter say, I remember those shows you did with Stan, which I guess means that there's still at least a cult interest out there.
Oh, I think there is, by virtue of the fact that the thing is being taught in some schools now. The Kennedy assassination, of course, is what we're talking about. And just by virtue of the books I see that you piled in front of you, I don't believe the publishers are hurting.
That's right. There's always a book. A new book is always out. And there's always a new inside report on TV.
That's true. That's true. All right. I don't know if anybody famous is going to contact us tonight, but I did put in a call to Jim Garrison. Now, Jim Garrison wrote a book. He's the former state's attorney, or whatever they call him down there in New Orleans. And, of course, Garrison was the first political type who did anything legally or anything with regard to indictments with regard to the Kennedy assassination. And when he did it, it was like a three-ring circus because everybody poo-pooed it. It was not too long after the Warren Commission came out with its report. And he did everything. His timing was not the greatest in the world because nobody was prepared to believe that Lee Oswald didn't act alone, or Lee Oswald didn't act at all, or whatever Garrison tried to prove at that time. So he, to cut a long story short, his prosecution or persecution of a particular individual in New Orleans didn't pay off. The guy was found not guilty, and that was all over. And it pretty well ruined Jim Garrison's career for a while. Later, he became a judge, and he's been a sitting judge in New Orleans Parish for some years now, and he wrote another book a couple of years ago. I don't have it. I attempted to get it, but it is not available at the bookstores that I encounter. But he may call in. There's a slight chance that he may call in tonight. And
that would be great.
You talked to
Jim Mars, who
okay.
is one of those guys who teaches a course in the JFK assassination at the University of Texas at Arlington, just outside of Dallas. Pardon me, he's a long-time Texas resident. I believe he's a native. Has really followed very closely the piecemeal developments over the years, especially as they pertain to Dallas. And his book, Crossfire, I think we can say is one of the best overviews of the assassination ever written, not only because he did a good job, but because it's been published in the last 2 years and contains a lot of interesting, updated information. A lot of those old nuggets of info or intriguing things you would hear about that he's been able to follow through. As a matter of fact, I guess as a classroom project, a lot of his students conduct continued research on the case. And they've uncovered some things, and it's kind of an ongoing thing. He's also in touch with Gary Shaw, and I think it's Gary Mack. I forget Mack's first name. Yeah. Who are also longtime Dallas researchers, very well-respected researchers who continue to feed information this way. So we've placed a call to Jim Mars. I understand he's over in Fort Worth on some business. We've tried to get a message to him, and he's invited to call in.
Yeah, he was on our last show.
Yes, I wanted to point that out. We've done 2 shows together in the past, and the second one, he was our guest, I guess, for the entire show. Great guy, good talker, very credible person, and never has a particular axe to grind. You'll find in his book that he's got a particular theory, but doesn't spend so much of his book on his theory that he ignores other pertinent evidence.
the Kennedy assassination has become such a cult item now that we have baseball cards, which...
It's unbelievable.
Rich Pachter dropped these off to Neil, and Neil left them for me. Coup d'etat, the assassination of John F. Kennedy, trading cards. So now, for the person who has everything for Christmas or whatever, here you have these small cards which have information on the back of them. Lee Harvey Oswald and all this kind of stuff. Suppressed evidence, just a patsy, misguided pilot, that's got to be David Ferry.
Here's Guy. I have a couple here. Here's Guy Bannister, George DeMorenshield, J.D. Tippett, James Jesus Angleton, former CIA director, and Oswald in Mexico. Actually, in all seriousness, this is a great brief reader on the case.
It is, because right here in 1967, New Orleans DA Jim Garrison arrested New Orleans businessman Clay Shaw for conspiring with Oswald and the recently deceased David Ferry to kill John Kennedy. And then it goes into a whole thing on that.
Incidentally, Garrison has long felt that his investigation of the assassination, which I think in retrospect uncovered a lot of very pertinent information, was sabotaged by the CIA. And there's a lot of evidence to indicate that's precisely what happened. A number of the researchers have quoted Richard Helms and subsequent CIA directors as saying, at the time of Garrison's investigation, let's do what we can to help Clay Shaw. He was the New Orleans businessman who was on trial, alias Clay Bertram, on trial for conspiring with David Ferry to kill the President of the United States. One thing I didn't know until I read Jim Marr's book was that Clay Shaw does have an intelligence background. He had a very pervasive intelligence background, and for a while was part of an organization known as Permindex out of Montreal that had long-time intelligence connections. And to be quite honest with you, just as a reader, as a consumer, again, I'm not as an authority so much as a reader, a voracious reader of the case, Jim Garrison and others make a very convincing case. And Jim Garrison will be the first to tell you that Clay Shaw was probably acquitted by that jury. The jury found that he was guilty of conspiracy, but they didn't feel as though he was guilty of the other charges, mainly because the judge in that case threw out Clay Shaw's admission to a jailer that he had in fact used the alias Clay Bertram. So Jim Garrison will argue that Clay Shaw was acquitted on a technicality. There is no question that his connection with David Ferry and the Guy Bannister group and all of those people playing all sides of the fence in New Orleans is one of the 2 or 3 keys to the assassination. And one thing I would also bring up is if you go through the literature or you're wondering what's in vogue these days with the JFK assassination, in the late 80s, mid to late 80s, we had a series of books. Mafia Kingfish by John Davis, excellent book. David Shine's Contract on America, an excellent book. And concluding that the mob popped the president. And yet there are some other books in the last 2 years, Jim Marr's Crossfire, and Jim Marr's has a little bit more of a sinister scenario in which he believes that the mob may have been in as shooters, but they were put together and allowed to put their plot together by higher-ups in the government.
And they've cleaned up the mess afterwards.
Yeah, and High Treason, a book I would also recommend. It's a bit more strident. It isn't it it's a little bit more for the person who's read a lot about the assassination and doesn't have to keep going to the footnotes. But Robert Groden, who many people will remember as the photographic expert, who did a lot of work with the House Assassinations Committee hearings in the late 70s. And Harrison Livingstone, a man I was unaware of, but is a longtime Kennedy researcher, put together the book High Treason. It's on a publishing house called the Conservatory Press. They believe that it was basically a CIA plot. And what you have here is researchers who do their research at the National Archives and rely heavily on information uncovered by Robert Blakey and the House Assassinations Committee in the late 1970s. If, for lack of a better term, we'll call them the Washington-based researchers, who tend to feel the mob killed Kennedy. Then you've got the other people who are like the acoustical evidence that came out with the Assassinations Committee, the photographic evidence of Robert Groden, and the Texan writers like Jim Mars, who tend to do most of their research with witnesses and principals in the case in the Dallas and Houston area, and those people will tend to tell you that they believe that it was a plot to kill the president, either hatched just within or just without, or just outside of the intelligence communities of the United States. So you're left with a choice of who you would like to believe.
Who happens to be sinister in your own mind at any given time when you read the book. I'm swayed by everything that I read.
Same here. I have trouble.
And so it's very difficult because I can't really lay the blame. I do go back to one of the original researchers, and that's Penn Jones, and the many, many programs that I've done down through the years with Penn. And Penn basically married a younger woman and dropped out of sight about 10, 15 years ago and has not been heard from since. Part of the deal, I understand, in her marrying him was, Penn, I will be delighted to marry you. We're going to have a wonderful time. You're not going to have this obsession anymore.
You're going to divorce the assassination
that's
before
it.
you marry me.
That's it.
Well, when I talked to Jim Mars the other day and invited him onto the show and asked him, hey, what's new, and let's trade some notes before we go on the air, he mentioned to me that it might be difficult for people outside of Dallas to realize this, but there's still people in Dallas who don't want to talk about this.
Mm-hmm.
They're afraid. A lot has been made. One of the things that most people know about the assassination is a lot of people have died untimely and rather inexplicable deaths.
You probably say the same thing for some people in New Orleans.
Yeah. Well, a lot of them are dead. And there's a fear among a lot of people in Dallas and Houston and New Orleans about talking about this. And friends know that what they've heard, and colleagues will say so-and-so was there, but there is still a lack of interest in talking about it publicly because a lot of these people know people who turned up dead.
Yeah.
There was a much publicized Lloyd's of London survey a number of years ago saying the chances of these people dying, these coincidental deaths, that turned out to be somewhat misleading. I guess you can play any game you want with statistics, but if you look at most of the people who have been bumped off were mob-related, as a rule. Many of them, however, were, in fact, intelligence community-oriented, and that might even bring us a little bit toward Miami. But, sort of to get things rolling, I remember when we had Jim Mars on a number of months ago, and just out of nowhere, when we brought him on the air, I just brought up the name Richard Nixon. Let's begin there, because if you would like to dissociate yourself from the United States for a minute and say, what if this happened in a third-world banana republic, halfway across the world in Asia? What would you think if the leader of the country had just been assassinated publicly, a public execution, if you will? You'd start rounding up the usual suspects, which could be the guy who stood to gain the most, who stood to assume office next, or who was just eliminated from office. So I brought up Richard Nixon's name, and there's some great Richard Nixon connections to this assassination that we could talk about tonight. I'm not going to libel anybody or slander anybody and say Dick Nixon was behind the assassination. But, a case could be made for his knowing a lot about it. On the other hand, Jim Mars tends to feel, like a lot of Texans do, that Lyndon Johnson may have had something to do with it. He certainly had a lot of strange behavior. We can go through some of that. And just keep in mind that Lyndon Johnson was no stranger to political violence in the past. There's some people who turned up dead who were his enemies in the past. It is not exactly beyond the realm of imagination to think that Lyndon Johnson had something to do with it. Prior to his death, he did confess to people that he suspected the CIA was in on the assassination of the president. It's a strange, entangled case, Stan, and as we kind of begin this, I realize there are people in the audience who are thinking two things. One, what are these guys talking about this crime for 27 years later? Very simply, it's the crime of the century. Anyone who's done a little bit of research on it knows that it's an unsolved crime. And
it's the mystery of our time.
It really is. It's the one that all of us hope that we can go to our graves at least having the answer to, because my life, at least on a certain part of it, will be unfulfilled unless I start to get some answers before I get too old. On the other hand, there may be people in the audience who weren't even born then, and they might be saying, what are all these children of the 50s and 60s talking about this about? Very simply stated, It was an event that changed the course of American history, and I think a lot of people have tried to document that and articulate it over the years. And I distinctly remember a phone call we took from a listener.
How many coup d'etats have we had in this country?
Well, I know you felt Watergate was a coup d'etat, and I don't know if I'm going to debate that with you, but that was a coup d'etat. I think the President of the United States was publicly executed to serve as a warning to others who were either about to take office or would eventually assume office. Again, LBJ and Richard Nixon. I want to add one more thing before I shut up for a second. The Fletcher-Prouty connection to all this. Fletcher Prouty, a longtime U.S. defense and CIA analyst, who has since divorced himself from the agency in that he still writes and speaks about it publicly. He's quoted in a number of books you will read about the Kennedy assassination, provides some great insider thought as to what was going on. I want to throw one thing out. Fletcher Prouty points out that shortly after the Bay of Pigs disaster with the Cuban exiles, many of the people involved in that operation within the intelligence agencies and the Defense Department immediately shipped out to Vietnam. And most people know a little bit of history, know that there was a coup and an assassination of the president of Vietnam 3 weeks before President Kennedy was killed. And while we are on the subject of scary thoughts and scenarios, which I'm sure will keep cropping up tonight, Fletcher Prouty believes that President Kennedy was assassinated by his own government because he was about to get out of Vietnam, and the government wanted desperately to get into Vietnam and had been getting into it a little deeper since 1945. He makes a pretty convincing case for it because he says, follow the people. Where did they go? And when they all start turning up in Saigon, then you say, oh, we're onto something. And the next thing you know, we're running a multi-billion-dollar-a-year construction business, the armament company. Everybody benefited from the Vietnam War, including the economy, and you almost hope that that wasn't the case.
I have always said that if you want to know why Jack Kennedy was killed in Dallas on that date in 1963, look at history the following 5 to 7 years.
And look what happened.
Because in 63, we had a coup d'etat, and in 66, our military involvement was beyond escalation. It was momentous in Vietnam. The Marines were landing, and hundreds of thousands of Americans in Vietnam. Of course, they were preceded by the CIA apparatus, those people who could benefit from financially from our involvement in this country overseas. Listen, I've said it for years. I have no doubt. I had Prouty on my show, I think, when I was in Philadelphia. And I don't know whether we were discussing this or we were discussing something else that he'd been involved in. I've also had Victor Marchetti on my show, a man who is wanted by the CIA.
Oh, they have crucified him.
Right, and who's responsible for, probably responsible for several agents' deaths.
Probably.
Because he publicly printed their names in publications that were printed out of this country. But if you look at it from an overall historical viewpoint, you're up there and you're looking down at the whole scene, you have to say, yeah, Kennedy was ticked off about the CIA. He basically attempted to dismantle the CIA following the fiasco at the Bay of Pigs, which he probably was responsible for more than any other human being, but he turned around and blamed it on the CIA because that's what a president of the United States has to do in order to survive a situation like that. If, by the way, we had a parliamentary government, form of government at that time, Kennedy would have fallen after the Bay of Pigs.
Oh, no question.
And he wouldn't have been able to blame anybody. He would have been out of office, but he was in there for another, 3 years?
Yeah, but I know what you're saying, and I know what you're going to say next. Kennedy blamed the CIA, though, internally. He fired some people, including Earl Cabell, the Dallas mayor's brother, who hated his guts after that, and Richard Bissell. But Kennedy took the heat, I think, publicly for that. But keep in mind, it was a CIA operation, and historians could argue that Kennedy was led down the primrose path by the CIA. Also, keep in mind, when these plots were first hatched, when the Bay of Pigs invasion was in its little embryo stage, and then we were thinking about popping off Castro to boot. Who was in on the very first embryonic meetings of that special military group but Richard Nixon? He was Dwight David Eisenhower's delegate to that, and he oversaw it. Even Dwight Eisenhower didn't know some of the things the CIA were planning for the Cubans. Kennedy inherited that. I know that sounds like a cop-out to the so-called revisionists who like to defend John F. Kennedy to the hilt on all matters, but it's basically true. Getting back to Vietnam real quickly, though, that was a CIA war, too. Until we had 400,000-plus Marines and Army units there, that was a CIA war, and was still a CIA war. Fletcher Prouty has said, why in the world did the U.S. ambassador to Saigon have to be the guy we went through in dealing with this war? It's because the CIA was running the war for a lot longer than most Americans thought before 500,000 soldiers took it over. So that, the other point I wanted to make regarding that whole scenario is just before, it was late September, early October, 1963, Robert McNamara goes to Vietnam, and he does a fact-finding survey for about 10 days, comes back to President Kennedy and says, we can't win there. We're paying over 80% of the French war before. We've got troops there now. We're quote-unquote advisors. We're CIA people. We're not going to win. It's untenable. The political situation in South Vietnam is such that we're just not going to be able to coordinate a war and let them fight their war. We probably should dismantle 1,000 troops by the end of the year. John F. Kennedy's reaction to all that was, you're right, I agree. What we're going to do is, I can't be reelected in 1964 by taking all the troops out of Vietnam. Now, think about that. We've got 1,000 advisors there. What was it, 16,000 people total?
Green Berets, Premier.
Guys, and he didn't feel that politically he could extract himself from Vietnam in 1964 without losing the election.
Well, yeah, but you have to understand the climate. We were still in the Cold War climate.
Exactly.
And I got to take a break here, but let's pick up on this when we come back. Because it's very interesting. You got to understand the climate that we were in following Korea and Red China and the Russians and Gary Powers and the U-2 and all this stuff that had been going on, which basically, you know, Kennedy came into office and the Cold War, the Berlin Wall, Ich bin ein Berliner, the whole bit. And we'll do that. Chuck Meyer is here. And if you'd like to start calling in, you're going to have to hold on the phone for a little while because you've got a couple of long-winded people here. But that's okay. These are the numbers tonight. 751-9463 is the number in Dade. Broward is 524 WIOD. Palm Beach or Jupiter or Stewart or West Palm Beach is 655 WIOD, 655-9463. The Kennedy assassination is a fascinating subject. Always has been, always will be. On the major program on News Talk Radio 610 WIOD. All right, we're here with Chuck Meyer, and we're discussing the Kennedy assassination. Before we go too far, let me throw in the book that I've been reading, and that is Libra.
Yeah.
Which is very much like something that Lee Harvey Oswald might have written had he been, let's say, convicted and given life imprisonment, sitting in his cell someplace in a federal penitentiary. This is the kind of thing that he might have written. It's written by a fellow by the name of
Don DeLillo.
Don DeLillo. I'm not familiar with his background, but boy, he did some research.
You know,
in fact, he probably did a lot more research than some of the Kennedy researchers.
And this is a novel, incidentally. Libra is a novel. It's a fictional account of what may have happened. Don DeLillo has written about 7 or 8 books, and I confess I've never read any of them until this one came around, and I read it, and I thought it was a literary triumph of sorts. I really enjoyed it. At the end of the book, I shouldn't give it away, but he does feel that Lee Harvey Oswald shot at the president, something that, quite frankly, I'm not convinced of, but the part of the book that I enjoyed very much was at various times of the book he will mention those cigar-smoking, oh-so-social CIA exiles and types who plotted the killing in their den and put Oswald together. I think it's an excellent account of how the intelligence community works that way. I like that book very much. I would recommend it.
It's amazing in view of the fact that he interweaves other CIA episodic adventures in places like Guatemala and places like that, and that kind of stuff, as we all know, with regard to the Contras and Nicaragua, still going on up until well, maybe even today, still going on. So it's it's, you know, you can't take every word that he writes as honest to God truth and the end to end all ends. But boy, to give you some insight into the possible planning and the possible reasons and all this is just. And I still think, Chuck, if you and I had the wherewithal, that we could find out right here within the sound of this signal what happened, what really happened.
I'll tell you, if I were the U.S. Justice Department, before I would let Orlando Bosch go, I said, forget about the little wristwatch we're going to make you wear, and forget about the logging in of all your associates. Just put your hand on the Bible here, Mr. Bosch, assuming you're still a good Catholic, and swear to us what happened at your house with Frank Sturgis and the Lee Harvey Oswald lookalike and Marita, I'll get her last name properly, in the statement she gave, the former Fidel Castro mistress who said that Bosch, Sturgis, the Oswald lookalike all met at Bosch's house and they drove to Dallas. The Justice Department incidentally does have the power to reopen at any time. Nobody's showing any.
They're not going to do that.
No, they're not. I think we took a call last time, somebody asking our opinion about would the case ever be solved. I personally think unless somebody has put something in a safety deposit box to be opened at their death, that we may not. But I think a lot of the critics, pardon me, would disagree and say that with a little bit of action and the right team of investigators, you could return indictments in a very short time.
But I think they are in a position where they have to have some hope, because if they give up hope, there's really not going to be any answers, whether or not there'll ever be any real answers. But I think that there are people in Miami. I am fascinated by the fact that I don't know how many shows I've done with regard to this topic on the air here in Miami, and the 3 radio stations that I've done talk on WNWS, on WINZ, and now on WIOD. And I can never recall getting a call from a Cuban American who wanted to discuss this seriously and said, let me give you a little information that maybe you don't have.
Yeah.
And that to me is amazing. I think they listen. I think they listen, okay? And I've talked to people like Mr. Martinez, who was one of the Watergate burglars. I've talked to him about this on the air and off the air. I've talked to one of the 2 U.S. civilians who was on the boats for the Bay of Pigs invasion, Grayston Lynch. I've talked to him on the air and off the air, and but nobody has ever called in and offered any information. Now, you're going to tell me that there's not one Cuban American that was involved with the Bay of Pigs down here who hasn't discussed Jack Kennedy's death with his compatriots and doesn't have his own theories and or hasn't picked up some kind of information?
The mindset among most of the Cuban exiles is that Castro did it. And, of course, Castro's behind everything to them. And at the same time, a lot of them have the feeling that they were not only betrayed by JFK, but they were betrayed by the CIA, and that they've been led along, too, only to be hung out later. So they're somewhat mistrusting. But,
well, I'd like tonight to offer a challenge to any of them who are still around, and there's a lot who are still around. And they're probably very comfortable in their existence by this time. They've become a part of Americana in Miami, and they probably are earning a good living, and they're probably scared to death that they might blow something by calling in and saying something. Well, what the hell? It'd be fascinating.
Well, I would like to think that some of them are a little more open-minded to the possibility that their cohorts may have done this, rather than thinking that it was Castro getting back very quickly, because so much of the information that has been disseminated over the years indicating that Fidel Castro, upon hearing that JFK was trying to kill him, retaliated by killing JFK, and we kept it quiet because we didn't want World War III. So much of that information has been discredited over the years, and a lot of it was deliberately planted, again, making you wonder, where was the source of the disinformation? The CIA is so culpable here because at so many strategic times over the years, they have planted the wrong story in hopes of heading off an investigation or further information that could lead to something. So, again, without slamming the Cuban exiles as a group, so many of them just are absolutely convinced that it was Fidel, and that we gringos are a little foolish for thinking anything other than it was a Castro retaliation. I think it's a lot more complicated than that.
All righty. Where do you want to go? What do you want to talk about? You want to talk about the new Hoover stuff that's come out?
Yeah, that's a place to start, just for tantalizing purposes.
Yeah, because a lot of people have listened to these shows and they've heard a lot of information. Let's take a short break, and when we come back, then we'll talk about some fascinating new information with regard to J. Edgar Hoover. And here's another situation where it seems like every year that goes by, we're getting another book on the founder of the FBI and what he was involved in, and God only knows where that all is going to go. But this is a man who hated every Kennedy, including the president that he had to work for and the attorney general that he had to work with, and hated him with a passion. We'll take a break and be back with a major program on News Talk Radio 610 WIOD.
Weekend Magazine with Chuck Meyer lets you know what's going on this weekend and get your weekend going with the day's latest information. Join us Saturday morning. Now, back to Stan Major on News Talk Radio 610 WIOD.
And Chuck Meyer is sitting right here. Before we do the Hoover thing and get really involved in our discussion, let's take a call from Chris in Naples, because I'm amazed that he can hear us in Naples.
I can hear you in Naples.
Oh, you can't hear us in Naples?
I can.
Oh, you can?
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
I guess I got a very good car.
Wow. Incredible. Well, maybe Bob Ludlam is listening over there.
Who's that?
Robert Ludlam, the Bourne Identity. He lives in Naples. Did you know that?
Ludlam?
Ludlam, author, L-U-D-L-U-M, author,
sorry.
big author.
Well, I shouldn't say, because there's a Lunsford who is who works for the Naples Daily News over here.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure if you had the name. Oh, I didn't. Oh, yeah, Ludlam.
Yeah, he lives over there with you, and you didn't even know that.
We also have Philip Abib living over here, too.
And Chuck Colson, who found God over in Naples.
That's right. We've all found God. We've all found God over here.
What's on your mind?
Well, when you were talking about this Kennedy, I found that very ironic. And, I mean, I'm not a big fan or follower of Jack Anderson.
Mm-hmm.
But I find that he is a relatively intelligent man, and I think he knows what's going on more than most people in the press. And his theory, I saw him on, I think it was Crossfire about 2-3 years ago. And his theory was the fact that many times they tried to, the CIA had gone over to Cuba to try to eliminate Castro. And supposedly the third time that it happened, or the second time that it happened, Castro had warned the CIA that if they were to do this again to try to kill him, that there would be a serious death in the United States. And he said they did try the third time and it didn't work, and he said, well, somebody will die in your country, and somebody that's very powerful. And he seems to think that it was Castro that did it.
Well, good old Jack may be part of the CIA disinformation campaign.
Yeah, Jack Anderson, if I'm not mistaken, was the guy who provided the bail money for some of the Watergate burglars. Jack Anderson has altered that story a little bit in that I believe in 1988, when the 25th anniversary shows were all making their appearance, Anderson put together one too. And while Anderson has long perpetuated the story, apparently his sources included mobsters like Roselli and Trapicante's people, that while Castro may have captured or turned one of the assassins into an assassin on his behalf, perhaps more likely scenario, and Jack Anderson has admitted this, that some of the people who were firing at Castro or involved in trying to kill him became so frustrated at not being able to do it, because some of the attempts were pretty silly, simply got together and plotted their own revenge on Kennedy, and Castro didn't have anything to do with it. I'm aware that there's a large body of evidence that can point toward Castro. In fact, just a couple of weeks before the president's assassination, he was in Brazil and said something to the effect, it was widely quoted on the Associated Press, that any American leader trying to eliminate me will be handled in kind. But
you know what that is?
That's macho.
That's following the. If you fail in an invasion of my country, you're not going to do that again. What you're going to do then is you're going to try to knock me off. I mean, that's rather obvious, and all of your efforts are going to be aimed at trying to eliminate me. If you think that you will eliminate me, then you'll eliminate the problem in Cuba. So that's only logic. So obviously that calls for some kind of threat on his part.
I mean, I understand exactly what you're saying, and you know, obviously we all know the Warren report was one of the biggest jokes to ever come out in history too, in the fact that it just nothing coincided correctly as far as
it was slipshod, is the best you can say
about it. And let's face it, and from my understanding, now I mean,
let's make, quite frankly, it was let's assure the American public that their president was killed by a lone assassin acting on weird motives, and let's wrap it up.
Okay. We've got our murderer, now let's prove that he was the murderer.
Right. Let me say this and let me ask you something. First of all, we all know that Lee Harvey Oswald was a definite scapegoat, but it seems to me that in the last, I mean, for years and years and years, it was funny that, I don't know which gentleman said it, but the fact that, you know, you couldn't put it past LBJ, and I thought for years that Johnson was definitely behind it because he had everything to gain from it. And it's funny that it happened in Texas, and that could be, you know, merely coincidental, but
well, it was supposed to happen in Miami.
Well, okay, but let me ask you this then. Don't you, how come we've never really ever heard anything about Jack Ruby?
Well, we've heard a lot about Jack Ruby.
Well, yeah, but it was all very skeptic as far as what we've heard about Oswald too.
Well,
I mean,
what do you want to know about Ruby?
Well, who was Ruby working for?
Oh, Ruby was a mobster, and Jack Ruby was told kill Oswald. He was stalking Oswald almost from the moment of the assassination.
Right.
There are very reliable reports that placed him at Parkland Hospital as the president was dying. Some critics have charged Jack Ruby was the guy who planted the bullet on the stretcher at Parkland Hospital. What was Jack Ruby? He was a hitman. He was a mobster, and he was fingered to kill Oswald.
I realized he was supposed to do that, and obviously that went to plan. I mean, it was just, but it's just ironic to me that with all the historians and everything, all the knowledge that we have in this country, that nothing has ever, basically, like you were said, how could we? I mean, you could die in 30 years and still not know who was behind this. And
all right, listen, I've got to move on. Good to talk to you in Naples, and if you run into Robert Ludlam, give him my best.
I sure will.
Thank you. He works for the Daily News over there.
Hoover.
Yeah, there's a book out. It's not the most literary, the greatest literary effort I ever read, but a guy named Michael Milan, M-I-L-A-N, that's not his real name, says that in the late 1940s he was approached by Frank Costello, a long-time New York mafioso chief who was a very close personal friend of J. Edgar Hoover. They used to take walks in Central Park together and trade information. And it goes without saying that J. Edgar Hoover, a little bit like Jim Garrison, has went virtually his entire life never thinking there was such a thing as organized crime. He knew it. But at any rate, according to Milan, Hoover, put together, along with mafia people, a group called the Squad. Approximately 10 people recruited to do dirty jobs, black bag jobs, either on behalf of the government or the mob.
Boy, this sounds familiar, doesn't it?
Yeah. Well, you know, the interesting thing about this is that it falls into place. J. Edgar Hoover was a master of control, destroying evidence if he needed to, manufacturing evidence if he wanted to, and we all, of course, learned after his death that he was hounding Martin Luther King, that he created incredible programs within the FBI, incredibly illegal programs, either spying on Americans or spreading disinformation about them. And in the book, Michael Milan claims that on the day of the assassination, he received a personal communication with J. Edgar Hoover, summoning him to Dallas to, quote-unquote, mop up some witnesses. The next day, he says he arrived on an airplane from Washington or New York, met up with a cab driver who has an alias or a false name in this book because he apparently still has family who is living, and was told that apparently the cab driver knew something about Jack Ruby, and the cab driver was the guy to be eliminated, and he takes him outside of Dallas a little bit and offs him and then leaves town. I talked to Jim Mars about this the other day and asked him, what do you make of this? And while he says that the book is quite credible in that as guys describing jobs that seem to fit the Hoover modus operandi, there is in fact no record of the murder of a cab driver in Dallas during the weekend of the assassination.
No.
So my personal feeling there is if Milan's telling the truth, he may have mopped up another witness and used the cab driver's story as sort of a literary license.
Yeah.
But there is no question that within hours of the assassination, J. Edgar Hoover was actively involved in suppressing evidence, changing evidence, and putting the lid on certain people within the FBI, many of whom knew Lee Harvey Oswald, knew of his whereabouts. And it's probably a good time to point out for those of you who are not real familiar with the case, that it seems all these years later unmistakable and inescapable that Lee Harvey Oswald, at one time or another, was an agent or an informant of either the FBI and or the CIA. Reportedly, there was a personnel file on Lee Harvey Oswald at CIA, a 201 file, as it's known. It was like 6 drawers deep. And a lot of it's locked up, some of it was destroyed. But if you read enough of the literature, you cannot escape the conclusion that Oswald worked with the CIA and or FBI for a lot of his life, and very well may have been informing on behalf of the FBI in the last months of his life on certain exile groups, etc. I think Lee Harvey Oswald knew what was going on when he was in Dealey Plaza the day that Kennedy was shot. I don't believe he shot the president. I don't believe he was on the 6th floor. But as soon as those shots rang out, in my mind, Lee Harvey Oswald said, I'm in trouble.
Yeah. Let's take another break, and we'll be back. If you would like to call in, we have a line available in Broward, and that is 524-WIOD, 524-9463. We'll get to your calls as quickly as we can tonight on the major program on News Talk Radio 610 WIOD.
Now, back to Stan Major on News Talk Radio 610 WIOD.
Okay, let's take calls. Been holding on for most of the hour. Hi, Leah.
How you doing, Stan and Chuck?
Okay.
There was an old article a while back. I don't know if you'd call it crap journalism or if other people had picked up on it. And while looking through the pictures of a Hustler magazine, they had like a 3-issue story on the Mafia and Onassis, and how the rule of the mob or something like that was when you abolish the man, you take his wife, and it's sort of, they went into a lot of the details on why he would want Kennedy out of the way and his love affair or falling in love with Jackie. And did anybody else pick up on that or write about that?
No, but it's been one of those soap operatic interesting things, sidelights that's been going on for all these years. The guy who publishes Hustler, whose name Larry
Flint. Yeah,
Flint. At one time, did he offer $1 million reward for anybody who had convictable information with regard to who shot Jack Kennedy? And I think he's still got the $1 million.
Yeah, there was a...
Of course, somebody tried to knock him off.
Yeah. There was...
Oh, wow. So the moral to this is if you win the Florida lottery this weekend, don't take $1 million and offer a reward for anybody for the shooter, the second or third shooter in Dealey Plaza, because somebody's going to come up and pop you, man.
I don't know if you guys got a chance to see this, but on Channel 2, about a few months ago, they had a thing that was real interesting with Walter Cronkite, where they went through the autopsy and the discrepancies between what was written and what the doctors actually saw.
That was the Nova TV special.
Yeah,
I got that videotape right here on the desk. As a matter of fact, it was given to me today, and I've never seen it. But since we're coming up on the network, and I'll lead back into Stan by saying, if we want to talk about some medical evidence a little bit later, a lot of evidence of forged autopsy photos, forged autopsy X-rays, and the medical evidence was botched to the point where it was purposely covered up. No question about it.
Okay, we're going to take a break for the news. Thank you very much. All righty, we will be back. Hold on the phone. Don't go away. On the major program on News Talk Radio 610 WIOD.
News Talk Radio 610 WIOD presents Stan Major. To get in touch and talk, call 751 WIOD from Dade County. In Broward, it's 524 WIOD or 655 WIOD in the Palm Beaches. The opinions expressed by the guest hosts or callers are not necessarily those of the station. Now, Stan Major on News Talk Radio 610 WIOD.
Going through some of these trading cards. I can't believe I'm reading these cards. They're fascinating, aren't they?
Right.
And this is by, let's give credit where credit is due, Eclipse Books, Post Office Box 1099, Forestville, California. And they have additional Friendly Dictators trading cards. The Iran-Contra scandal trading cards. Rotten to the Core, New York City political scandal trading cards. Oh, man.
Apparently this guy's a violinist with the San Francisco Symphony, and he does trading cards on the side. They're called coup d'etat trading cards at a bookstore near you, I'm sure.
Yeah, fascinating thing is he gives credits here to the books that he read to put these cards together.
Yeah, good reading list.
Yeah, a good reading list. Coup d'etat, the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Trading cards meant to serve as an introduction to this most complicated subject. In preparing this material, the author consulted the following books: Mafia Kingfish, Conspiracy by Anthony Summers, Crossfire by Jim Mars, Best Evidence by David Lipton, which we mentioned with regard to the shenanigans that went on during the autopsy. Reasonable Doubt by Henry Hurt. The Whitewash series by the Dean of Assassination Researchers, Harold Weisberg. Coincidence and Conspiracy by Bud Finsterwald. They've Killed the President by Robert Sam Anson. And a pretty good list. Incredible. So if we come across anything interesting, we'll let you know. We already have with the mayor's, the general who was one of the second in command of the CIA and who was the guy who called the president on the phone at 4 a.m. on the morning of the Bay of Pigs and asked for air support, and the president turned him down. And this is General
Cabell.
General
Brother
Charles
Cabell was the mayor of
and a man who hated John Kennedy from that moment on, and even publicly. I think it's interesting that Clay Shaw introduced him in New Orleans in 1962 to the Foreign Policy Association as a speaker. Interesting. Ah, boy, these things all kind of fall together, don't they?
You put 50 or 60 names together, names as diverse as Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon out on the political end, and people like David Ferry and the Guy Bannisters on the other end, and it's amazing that of their connections. Here's a quick one.
The Warren Show?
A linchpin, as far as I'm concerned, to this case. How about this one? 1947, Richard Nixon writes a letter to an investigating committee in Congress on behalf of Jack Ruby, exempting him from having to testify before that committee, indicating that he's been assisting the United States government in its investigation. And it was long considered a phony memo, a phony letter to the committee by Richard Nixon. And even Gerald Ford later admitted, I've seen thousands of government documents in my years. This appears to be authentic. What in the world was Richard Nixon doing, writing letters to congressional committees exempting Jack Ruby from having to testify before those committees in 1948?
I don't know. Okay, we got a mobile on our brand new Star IOD line, by the way, which I haven't mentioned, which you can use, I guess, if you're a Bell South. You can get a free call if you're a Bell South. If you're something else, good luck. Chris.
Yes, Dan. Boy, I hope it's free or I'm going to have to fudge my expense report. I'll tell you.
Are you Bell South?
Yes, I am.
Then, according to my information, you should be. Well, I've been listening to Neil. What does he know?
Yeah. I just tuned in, so I hope I'm not rehashing, but a very, very interesting subject. I called you last week, Stan, when you were filling in for Neil about Dick Estelle and the radio reader. I don't know if you remember, but at any rate, the way I found that guy is they read books to the handicapped, and they were reading a book called Promises to Keep by George Bernau. That's B-E-N-A-U. And it's a fiction book, but it's based on the assassination and taking the assumption that Kennedy lives. Very, very interesting book. If this is a subject that fascinates you, I think you'd find it very interesting.
Yeah, I ran across a book at our friendly public supermarket of all places about a year ago, which I regret I did not buy because I don't remember the name of it. It was a work of fiction, and it did have to do with Kennedy living through this whole thing.
That may be it.
Or somebody who could go back in time and prevent it and find out what happened. And if I was going to write a book based on time travel, I guess if given my choice to go back to a certain day, I'd probably go back to the 21st of November, 1963, and try to stop this whole thing.
Exactly.
Yeah, I've been almost sheepish to admit to people because occasionally you're in a group situation and people will say, if you could relive any minute in history, where would you go? And, I'd go back to the cross and watch Jesus.
I don't want to mess with things that much.
I sheepishly I admit that I would go to Dealey Plaza.
I would not dress.
I'd stand behind that picket fence. I really would.
Dan, it's funny because I found the book in a grocery store also. I was on vacation in Georgia, and I was with this Dick Estelle, fascinated by this, and I was in and out of the car and missed several chapters, and finally lost my way, and I was on vacation and found the book in a grocery store and just bought it right away and was glued to it.
All right, I'm going to check it out. We've got one of the authors, Jim Mars, on the line, so good to talk to you, Chris. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Jim.
Yes, good evening.
How you doing?
Pretty good. How's everybody in Florida?
Oh, we're doing fine. Chuck Myers here, our Stan Major, of course, and we're doing part 3 of our never-ending search for the truth. And you joined us for a good deal of it the last time we did the show, so you know what we're all about.
That's true. By the way, I just got in on the tail end of that little segment there, and somebody was talking about if they could go in a time machine, they'd go back and witness in Dealey Plaza, right?
Right.
Let me tell you something that kind of blows me away, but the further I get in this thing, I'm becoming more and more convinced. I think there was a whole lot of people in Dealey Plaza on November the 22nd, 1963, who actually had nothing to do with the gunmen that were shooting at Kennedy, but they were just there to observe what was happening.
That's a fascinating statement.
You mean to babysit the affair?
No, not necessarily the babysit. I think that there were people from intelligence services all over the world. I mean, possibly the KGB and the Mossad and probably the Cuban DGI, and I think they kind of had gotten wind of what was going on, and they just kind of went to see what was happening.
Woo.
The reason I say that is because, there was military intelligence people crawling all over the place.
From the 112th unit.
Made the mistake of going into the school book depository, and it was sealed up. He had to show his credentials before he could get out. So we know there was military intelligence people crawling around. Then you got all these people with Secret Service identification.
Yeah. I've always wondered about that.
And there were people. There was the mafia guy, Braden, who was there, and who said, he got arrested right across the street from the book depository and told the Dallas police, well, I was in town to visit H.O. Hunt, the oil man, but I never went in Dealey Plaza, and here's a picture of him down there in Dealey Plaza with the crowd of people. So
he's a guy
there was just all kinds of people there.
Brading, incidentally, met Ruby the night before at the Cabana Hotel.
Yes,
Is that true?
Yes.
Tell me about the...
I'm not sure it's been established that he actually met with Ruby, but he and some friends were staying at the Cabana, and, of course, Jack Ruby was there that very night.
Well, before we go, don't forget our good friends here in Miami, Howard Hunt and the Tramps, okay? Let's not leave them out. I'd love to get sued so we can find out.
Tell me, Jim, about that. A lot of people... we talked last time about Woody Harrelson's father, Charles Harrelson.
Right.
We'll get into that in a minute. But the Tramps arrested in Dealey Plaza, the one is a dead ringer for E. Howard Hunt. Has that never been established? I mean, that's E. Howard Hunt as far as I'm concerned.
Well, I'll tell you something. This fits right in your own backyard there. There was this publication out of Washington called Spotlight, and several years ago they ran an article, and they said, we've discovered a CIA document where top CIA people were saying, hey, how are we going to explain E. Howard Hunt being in Dallas the day Kennedy was killed? And based on that, they wrote an article and, of course, raised the question, well, was he there and was that him? And Hunt sued him for libel. And a originally they heard it before a judge, and the judge kind of ruled in favor of Hunt, so they appealed, and then a jury, I think in Miami, certainly in Florida, I think it was in Miami, just 2 years ago or so, heard the whole case, and they ruled against Hunt, indicating to me that they heard enough evidence to make them believe that maybe he was in Dallas that day.
Mm-hmm.
And, of course, Hunt has told 2 or 3 different stories on exactly where he was. He's one of those, kind of like Richard Nixon, that is a little bit vague on really where he was the day of the Kennedy assassination.
Can't really remember. Maybe he has some friends who can help him out.
He might have been here, he might have been there. He really
I mean, who in the hell can't remember where they were on that day?
Yeah, Nixon couldn't, and he was in Dallas. But,
That's true. In fact, he flew out of left field less than an hour or so before Kennedy arrived.
Yeah. Speaking of E. Howard Hunt, I might want to point out to kind of complete the role on him. E. Howard Hunt has also denied at times that he was the head of the CIA station in Mexico City in September of 1963 when Lee Harvey Oswald made his very controversial visit there that the CIA used to discredit him later on, too.
That's true. By the way, David Atlee Phillips, who is recently deceased and was a very high-ranking CIA guy, and some other people, I believe, have said, well, yes, Hunt was in Mexico City at that time.
You know, the thing that...
they can't seem to get their story straight.
Yeah, Jim, the thing that really ticks me off is I've been with 3 radio stations in Miami. I was with one station in the late 70s. I was with another station up till 80. Then I've been with that station again for a year. Now I've been with this station. I've done all kinds of shows in this town on the Kennedy assassination. Do you think I can get any of the Cuban Americans, the exiles, to call in here and participate in this thing with any of their information or theories? And it really begins to tick me off that we can't get them to call in. I know they listen, Jim. They have to be listening. This has got to be something that's near and dear to their heart.
They're very much interested, and let me make a point right here. I really feel very, very strongly about the Cuban exiles. I feel like probably they, among all groups of people, have been so severely abused by so many people, and particularly our government. Okay? One group tells them, we're for you, and then on the other hand, they turn around and knock them down, you know. President Kennedy gets up in the Orange Bowl and tells them, gets them cheering by saying that, I'm going to see that the Cuban flag is flying over a free Cuba again, and at the same time he's allowing the FBI, ordering the FBI to make raids on their arms caches and stuff, and putting a stop to their raids. We have been so ambivalent in our policies towards those people. I can understand why they're probably internally very much in a turmoil. They don't understand what's going on. Another key point I would like to make to the Cuban Americans and to the Cuban refugees that are in your audience listening is that the idea has been propagated all these years that it was Kennedy who pulled the plug on the Bay of Pigs invasion and prevented a successful invasion that would regain their homeland, and that's simply not the truth. Kennedy was not even aware that this invasion was going to take place until after he got elected. And after he got elected, he said privately, he told the CIA, he told the military, and he was even quoted in the New York Times publicly as saying he was not going to allow U.S. military forces to invade Cuba, another country, okay? And yet the CIA officials who were in charge of those Cubans kept assuring them that there would be an umbrella of air cover and that the Navy and the Marines and the Air Force would all be there to support them, and it simply wasn't true. They need to understand that their hostility and their hatred should be shifted from President Kennedy, who, regardless of whether he was right or wrong, at least was honest about what he was going to do and not do, and that should be shifted to those CIA officials who lied to him and told him that all this protection and all this military support was going to be there when they knew and had been told that it would not be there.
Okay, I got it. Can you hold on? How long can you spend with us, Jim?
Hey, I hit the house here and got me a bite to eat, so I'm with you until you tell me to go away.
Great. Hold on. We're going to take a short break here, and we'll be back. Jim Mars is on the line from Texas, and he's the author of Crossfire, which is one of the later books concerning the Kennedy assassination. We'll be back with him and Chuck Meyer right here on News Talk Radio 610 WIOD.
It's the Stan Major program on News Talk Radio 610 WIOD.
Okay, we're back, and Chuck Myers here in the studio. Author Jim Mars is in Texas, the author of Crossfire. And is your book out in paperback, Jim?
It will be out in a softcover edition this fall in an expanded version with an index, with a reference section, and possibly with some new material.
Great.
So I would look for that.
Okay.
Can I mention one other thing that kind of gets my goat right now?
Be my guest.
I'm not sure if y'all are getting this in Florida, but I would assume probably you are. Right now on television, there's running some ads for a videotape of life in Camelot, and you get to see all these home movies of John Kennedy and his kids, and he's swimming around, and what a great guy. See, and it's used to promote Life magazine. You know, if you buy a subscription, you get the video. And this really gets my goat, because of all the major media, it was Life magazine that probably did more to cover up the truth of the Kennedy assassination. They bought the famous Zapruder film and then locked it away so nobody could see it for about 15 years. It was only after a legal subpoena from District Attorney Jim Garrison in New Orleans that film ever finally got to be seen by people, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And then on top of that, they wrote articles that were just blatantly untrue. Early on, they wrote articles saying, well, he turned around at the last minute and was shot from the front in the throat, which is simply not true. And when Life magazine in the late 60s some of the editorial people began to have second thoughts and began to do their journalistic job as far as really investigating and let's find out what happened, it was stopped by the higher-ups at Life magazine, and they were told it's not our job to investigate the Kennedy assassination, and yet now they're lionizing John Kennedy and using him to sell their magazine. I don't know. I just find that very reprehensible.
To add two things to that, Jim, anybody who has seen the Zapruder film has to conclude that the president was killed. The headshot that killed him came from the right front. I mean,
absolutely.
I realize that there are certain optical and mathematical equations that can play a role here, but when you see it, you cannot escape the conclusion the president was hit with a front right headshot.
Basic laws of physics come into play.
Exactly. And the Warren Commission went through incredible gymnastics to try to refute that.
But in the magic bullet.
And I think it's extremely important, because I think we touched on this a little bit last time Jim was on the show about how, could this ever happen again? Well, probably not the way it happened, because in 1963, the networks weren't following the president around live with videotape cameras and the ability to shoot things back on the satellite. Just think back when Ronald Reagan was shot at the hotel in Washington, D.C. We saw replays of that maybe 8 or 10 times within an hour and a half after it happened.
Right.
It didn't happen in Dallas. We didn't get to see the film. We didn't get to see it for 12 years until, as you mentioned, it was played for the jury in Garrison's trial. And that was important. The other thing I wanted to point out is, speaking of Life magazine, its publisher was Henry Luce, and his wife, Claire Booth Luce, a very prominent conservative at the time, as students of the assassination know, was approached right after the assassination by some Cuban exiles who were offering her information that turned out to be disinformation and probably could have only come from the American intelligence community, information that was supplied to her in order to, again, disrepute Lee Harvey Oswald. So, Life magazine was perhaps the most popular American magazine of its time at that time, and it was extremely influential. Time Life has been extremely influential and has been plugged in to the hierarchy of American, the political structure in this country for a number of years.
That's true. And if they wanted to really do the job that they claim they're doing, they, instead of trying to debunk everybody who stands up and tries to present information on the Kennedy assassination, they would go out and really study and investigate and look at that information and find out what's true and what's not. But they're not doing that.
Jim, what is the status on Carlos Marcello now?
I'm not real sure. I understand he's now out of jail, but he's not in very good health, and I'm not real sure that he's still the major player that he used to be.
I think the family's basically been pretty well split, and since his jail term, well, is there anything new in your ongoing research from the New Orleans aspect?
Well, this is not really new, but I don't think anybody's aware of this. I remember at the time of the trial, basically what happened to Carlos Marcello is that they managed to get some people very close to him, and they were tapping his telephone, and they recorded a series of meetings. They recorded his telephone conversations, and using that, they managed to convict him on income tax evasion and this, that, and the other thing. What was really amazing about that whole thing was that at the time of his trial, the judge ordered something like several hundred pages of these transcripts of Carlos Marcello's conversations locked away, kept from the public, because they dealt with the Kennedy assassination. I mean, my God, here's a top mob boss who's talking, unguardedly about what might have really been going on. And the judiciary, instead of locking into that and finding out what he may have really known about it, orders it locked away. I would love to know what he was saying in those conversations.
What time frame are we talking about?
Oh, we're talking about in the late 70s, early 80s when this trial was going on that put him into prison.
Might also use that connection to point out that we mentioned Charles Harrison a little while ago, and just as quick background, Charles Harrison may have been one of the tramps arrested in Dallas that day. Charles Harrison, of course, is doing life in prison now in Texas for assassinating a federal judge. He has told reporters that he had something to do with November 22nd, 1963. And beyond that, apparently when he was hired to murder Judge Wood, he used he bragged that he had something to do with the Kennedy assassination in order to get the contract on Judge Wood, and he was hired to kill Judge Wood, correct me if I'm wrong, Jim, by an associate of Carlos Marcello.
Yes.
Jimmy Chagra?
That did figure into it. In fact, all that came out in courtroom testimony. This is not just rumor and innuendo. This was testimony under oath in a court of law. And the point is that according to the testimony, he went to the Chagras and he said, hire me to be your hitman, and my credentials are that I participated in the John F. Kennedy assassination. Now, on the one hand, the government tells us that this was the assassination was just the work of one lone disgruntled individual, and yet on the other hand, they tell us that the Chagras were these mob-connected, top-ranking drug kingpins and all like that, and they heard this story from Harrelson, and instead of running him out of their office and saying, well, you must be an idiot for telling us this, because we all know it was just Oswald by himself, they paid attention to it. They thought that was pretty good, and they hired him to kill Judge Wood. So, we're getting these conflicting stories out of the government.
Incredible. Yeah. Let's take another phone call. Let's go to Rich in West Boca.
That's pretty tough to follow.
Yeah, right. You waited all that time to say that.
I'm telling you. I sent Neil those coup d'etat trading cards.
Yeah, where'd you pick those up?
Well,
and Jim, are you aware of these trading cards?
Well, I'm aware of the Iran-Contra trading cards, and I have been invited to come to Dallas this week, as a matter of fact, where I understand that they're going to be unveiling some JFK assassination trading cards.
Well, Jim, that's what these are, and they're published by the same company that did the Iran-Contra cards, written by the same guy. His name is Paul Brancato, I believe. And the artist is a guy named Bill Sienkiewicz, who's known primarily as a comic book artist, but he also did a book called Brought to Light, which was about the Iran-Contra stuff and that whole thing, published by the same people that published these trading cards.
I got to tell you, Jim, we've been looking them over, and this is not fun and games here. There's a lot of really interesting information, and they do give credit to your book as one of the books that was used to put these things together. Maybe you better hit them for some money when you see them.
Well, I think it's wonderful that the information's finally getting out to a broader audience. And the idea of the trading cards strikes me as being pretty interesting. And, you know, for years I've thought that probably what really needs to be done is some computer whiz kid needs to take all of these names and all of these dates and places and throw them in a computer and start seeing all these patterns and connections between all this.
Yeah, put them on a timeline analysis like David Lifton did for his Best Evidence book, which really started to, it's what made the case fall into place for him, as he pointed out in his book.
Exactly. That's like, for instance, when the bulk of the American public finally becomes aware of the pattern in the background of Lyndon Johnson of dead witnesses, suppressed evidence, intimidated witnesses, the use of federal authorities to scotch any investigations into him and his activities and all like that, I think they're going to start putting two and two together and say, my God, that sounds like exactly what happened after the Kennedy assassination.
Well, I think some of the people are starting to realize where Johnson is at, especially in the wake of that book by Robert Caro about the ascent of power that told how Johnson stole a couple of elections.
Exactly.
And a couple of radio stations.
It borders on humorous if it wasn't so serious. The fact that Robert Caro, with his incredible credentials, originally was welcomed by the Johnson people, and they helped him, gave him carte blanche at the Lyndon Johnson Library in Austin, and let him go through all the documents and the papers, and he was the hero of the moment. But the problem was Caro actually did his work, and he was honest about it, and he began to present what Johnson was really like and what had really gone on, and now I could be wrong, but it's my understanding that he's been barred from the Johnson Library, and now he's an anathema to him.
Well, it sounds like Bob Woodward with the Nixon Library, and of course he wrote the book on Belushi with his widow's cooperation at first also.
Right. By the way, now that you mention that, I'm sure you guys are probably aware that at the time of Watergate and in the Watergate tapes, we heard that Nixon was authorizing the $2 million hush money to E. Howard Hunt and to these people, and he said, this could open up the whole Bay of Pigs thing. And of course, there's been a lot of speculation over what he was really talking about. I was blown away just recently when one of my associates brought to me a book by H.R. Haldeman called The Ends of Power, okay? And on page 39, Haldeman, who Nixon was talking to at that time and addressed those remarks to, actually comes out and explains what he was talking about, and he said he was really talking about the Kennedy assassination.
That's right. Haldeman says that the Bay of Pigs was a code word that Nixon used, meaning the Kennedy assassination. And when he kept saying all this stuff about the Bay of Pigs things will come out, we don't want it to happen, he meant the JFK. Have you heard this story, Jim? And I think this one's in high treason, that the 18-minute gap on the White House tapes supposedly includes talk of the Kennedy assassination. And I know that sounds like wild rumor, but I've heard that Rosemary Woods has claimed that it does, and I've also heard that Rosemary Woods, or somebody close to her, has the 18-and-a-half-minute gap. It was locked away so she wouldn't be made to look any worse than she did.
Mm-hmm. I don't know that to be true, but that wouldn't surprise me a bit.
Richard, anything else?
Well, I just want to mention that if anyone's interested in these cards, they're available from Eclipse Enterprises. It's P.O. Box 1099, Forestville, California, 95436. They're $8.95. Also, believe it or not, local comic book dealers can get these for you. That's who distributes them.
Where did you get this set?
From a local comic book distributor.
Interesting.
They're really good.
Thank you, Rich.
Glad you like them, guys. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Isn't that fascinating that it seems the only way we get truth these days?
Amazing. Absolutely amazing. Let's take another short break, and we'll continue, Jim. Just hold on. We'll be back with Jim Marth, the author of Crossfire, who's in Dallas, Texas. And we'll take your calls here at 751-9463 in Dade. Broward is 524-WIOD. And if E. Howard Hunt is listening, or Frank Sturgis, hell, come on. Give us a call.
Now, back to Stan Major on News Talk Radio 610 WIOD.
Back with Chuck Meyer, who's news director of WIOD and a real assassination aficionado. He's a nutcase, is what he is. And Jim Mars, who's not a nutcase, but who's a man who's been following all of this and even teaches classes now. Jim, what's happened to the original researchers, the Harold Weisbergs, the Penn? We know what Penn Jones kind of dropped out after he got married to some young thing who said, I'll be happy to marry you, Penn, but you're going to have to divorce the Kennedy assassination to marry me. What about some of the other original researchers? Have they kind of fallen by the wayside?
Well, not really. Penn Jones really hasn't fallen by the wayside. I think he just finally ran out of patience and money and decided it was time for somebody to take up the torch. He's still here and going strong in Texas, and a lot of the researchers here still keep in touch with him. Harold Weisberg, I haven't heard a lot about him recently, but I'm sure he's still filing FOI suits. And, of course, Mary Farrell here in Dallas is still collecting everything that has ever appeared on the assassination. And
I understand she has the ultimate in all of the printed and published information.
Absolutely.
She is an encyclopedia on the Kennedy assassination.
Right, and of course, she has always kind of played a behind-the-scenes role, but I want to tell you, her impact has been very great. Authors and documentary producers and everybody all the way back to that movie Executive Action, they all just go to Mary Farrell. She is just a wealth of information.
I got to ask you a general question here about the media and the American media's attitude with regard to the coup d'etat we had in 1963. Why is it that the only documentaries we ever see that are fair with regard to the investigation of the Kennedy assassination are produced in Great Britain, they're produced in Canada, they're produced overseas? Even when we had the big 25th anniversary celebration and all the media hype, we still couldn't get what I consider a decent investigative report done by a television primarily in this country.
That's true, and at the risk of getting on my soapbox, now you're really hitting my sore spot. Assassination, political corruption, and skullduggery, I mean, that's really nothing new. That's gone on all throughout history, and I can accept it, at least from a standpoint of, well, you know, that goes on, it's gone on, it will go on, that kind of happens. But coming from the news media myself, I am just absolutely chagrined and appalled at the timidity, the hesitancy on the part of the news media, who as you well know, never loses an opportunity to cloak themselves in the First Amendment and assure everybody that they're the watchdogs of the public. You know, you're sitting there tonight, you're talking to a large audience, you're talking about some very pertinent and meaningful information, and yet the major media in Miami, the media in Dallas and in Fort Worth, and in the major cities around the country, they ignore it. They act like nothing's going on.
Let me draw a parallel here. In the famous Washington Post coverage of the Watergate scandal, if Woodward and Bernstein had not had the deep throat source, their investigation probably wouldn't have gotten off square one. Is that correct?
Exactly.
In the Kennedy assassination, there has never been what you could classify as a similar, quote, deep throat source for anybody. Somebody who could have the bona fide credentials to be able to tell a newspaper reporter like a Dave Mars or whatever that, by the way, I want you to check this lead on the Kennedy assassination and follow this lead through. And then I want you to talk to this person.
Well, that's not exactly precisely correct. In the case of the Kennedy assassination, there's been a literal plethora of people who have come forward and said, I know what went on. Some of them actually were even quoted in various news media. Many of them were ignored. In fact, that is what has created this confusion, which leads to the point to today where the major media today will freely admit that there's controversy over the killing of the 35th President of the United States. But what kills me is they won't take that one extra step to say, well, okay, let's cut through that controversy and find out what the truth really is. And I think the answer to your question and the reason for that situation is that all of the major media are dependent. I mean, let's face it, they wouldn't be able to print their newspapers, they wouldn't be able to go on the air if they didn't have their advertising, and their advertising comes from the major corporations, and we're talking about the business heavyweights of this country, and those are the people that don't want to talk about it.
I want to go back to the calls, but I just want to ask you one more thing about this situation in comparison to Watergate. Can't you also say that the CIA and the FBI and other people who were involved in this put out so much disinformation that if a person did come forth with something, you didn't know whether, if you were a researcher or an investigative reporter, you had no way of knowing whether or not this was something that was put out to get you off the trail. And I'm thinking that infamous book that was published about 4 or 5 years after the assassination, that was published in Europe. Can't think of the name of it now, but
America.
I think it tried to blame the Robert Depew and the Minutemen. And it really ticked Robert Depew off, because I had him on my show in Kansas City about the Kennedy assassination. It really ticked him off because he claims that his people weren't involved. He didn't have anything to do with it, never did have anything to do with it, that he was just being blamed by somebody in government who actually was responsible for what happened.
I think there's a good deal of truth to that. The cover-up in the Kennedy assassination has never been a true cover-up in the sense that the truth and the information was never made available. It's been a cover-up through obfuscation. They have thrown out so many red herrings and so much misinformation that they simply have clouded the waters to the extent that nobody either can or will seem to be able to cut through it and find out what was really going on.
Would you agree that there's probably not a hell of a lot in that gigantic CIA computer in Virginia about the Kennedy assassination?
Well, having not had access to it, I really don't know.
But don't you think that material was pretty well taken care of in 63 and 64?
Well, they have all kinds of ways to hide information. In other words, if you're a top official of the CIA and you have some really hot files, you don't put them in the CIA files under the proper titles, you know.
Mm-hmm.
What you do is bury them in the Forestry Service computer under the title of tree itch or something, you know, and you know how to get to that, but nobody else who has the codes knows how to get to it. I might point out that, speaking of the CIA, just recently I obtained a copy of a book, of a pamphlet thing called The United States in Search of Enemies, an annotated national security reading list. And it's by John Stockwell. John Stockwell was a high-ranking CIA official, a station chief, who was heavily involved in covert operations in Africa, in Southeast Asia. And in 1977, he left the agency and became a whistleblower, and went to Congress and told them of some of the skullduggery and illegal and unethical activities that the CIA was involved in, and in fact ended up writing a book called In Search of Enemies. He now has this annotated national security reading list, and I was quite gratified to find under a section entitled On Killing and Making U.S. Presidents, the Assassination of John F. Kennedy, he lists my book Crossfire by Carolyn Graff, and he states this may be the best single book on the Kennedy assassination. And this is from a former ranking CIA man, and yet right here in my own hometown in Dallas and in Fort Worth, they can't even seem to get around to reviewing Crossfire.
No kidding. That's incredible. Absolutely incredible.
It is incredible, and let me hasten to point out that I'm not looking for publicity to sell books.
No, but you would think after all...
Somebody wants to rip my book upside one side and down the other, hey, have at it.
Yeah.
But let's discuss it.
Yeah,
let's discuss it. Let's look at the information and find out if it's not true. I'm the first one that wants to know if the information's not true. But for the news media to simply ignore an issue like this is, to me, just beyond belief.
Incredible. Let's take another call. Let me figure out where we're going here. Arnold in Miami.
Yeah, hi, Stan.
How you
Chuck.
doing?
Jim, I just want to thank you. I read your book about a month or two ago, and it led me to the Garrison book on the Trail of the Assassins. And I finished reading it about 4 or 5 days ago, and I think it's the most devastating, shattering experience I've ever had, because I've read just about every book on the assassination, way back to Mark Lane and Edward J. Epstein. And up until the point I read your book and Garrison's book, I was of the attitude, well, you know, it's so mixed up, it's so confusing, we're never going to know the answer.
That's what they want you to believe.
Yeah, that's what Garrison says in his book. He calls them false sponsors. CIA tries to set up false leads to get everybody confused and keep muddying up the waters.
Are you aware? Let me make a point real quick here. You know, the national media pretty well raked Garrison over the coals.
Yeah.
And even after his ill-fated attempt to investigate the Kennedy assassination in New Orleans, the federal government turned around and indicted him for accepting bribes from criminal elements, and he was acquitted on that. And then they turned around and the IRS went after him, claiming that he had failed to pay taxes on this illegal bribes that he had not taken from the criminal element, and he managed to get acquitted on that. And so they really have been after him, and a lot of people are under the impression that Jim Garrison must have been a publicity hound and a no-count and some guy who was just trying to make a name for himself. And the fact is, none of that is true, and the proof of that is that today Jim Garrison is an appeals court judge, an elected position in New Orleans, and when I was through there last fall, I had lunch with Judge Garrison, and he is still a very proper, thoughtful, intelligent guy, and the people, and I talked to everybody from the cab drivers to the store owners, the people in New Orleans to this very day hold him in the highest esteem.
I know. I think he's a true American hero.
I do too.
I just wish somebody, maybe someone like Oliver Stone, could get a hold of his book and make a film. He has maybe enough clout in Hollywood, and he has the integrity to make a film out of it. I mean, this is real.
I can't say anything, but just wait.
I just want to mention a few other things. Just to play devil's advocate for a second. There's one thing that always bothers me. The fact there's a column, there's a Sunday magazine in Miami called Tropic Magazine, and there's a columnist named Joel Achenbach, and he has a column called Why Things Are, where he answers questions. And a few months ago, someone asked him who really killed President Kennedy, and he kind of smugly answered, well, you know, we've heard all these crazy nut conspiracy theories, but no one can explain the fact that Oswald got the job in the school book depository in the middle of October, weeks before anyone knew that Kennedy was coming to Dallas and exactly what route he was going on.
Got it from Ruth Payne, did he not, Jim?
Right. Who herself was connected to some groups that were thought to be intelligence connected, and her husband worked at Bell Helicopter and was in contact with some ranking security type people.
Yeah. So how long before the assassination was that Dallas trip planned?
Well, it's kind of interesting. The idea that they were going to add a motorcade through Dallas, actually, that decision was made prior to Oswald obtaining the job at the school book depository.
Yeah, I think one book said June '63. I don't know.
Well, if you take a look at the political situation at that time, it was rather evident that Jack Kennedy, as president and a Democrat, was going to have to tour the state of Texas.
Had to win Texas.
Had to win Texas, and...
Had
to win Texas, and obviously when you've got a vice president from Texas, that's another compelling reason, because he can influence you into coming to Texas also.
And all the high-ranking Texas Democrats at the time were feuding. He had to go to Dallas to repair the fences, and And, they said, let's do a motorcade, let's do the whole 9 yards, and there you have it.
All right, I'm going to break for the news. Thank you very much for your call. Jim, hold on.
Okay, thank
You're
you.
doing great. We got all the lines tied up. We'll be back with Jim Mars, author of the book Crossfire, with Chuck Meyer, not an author, but a widely read news director, right here on the major program. New York Yankee baseball back with you tomorrow. And, of course, Larry King following us right here on News Talk Radio 610 WIOD.
Presents Stan Major. To get in touch and talk, call 751 WIOD from Dade County. In Broward, it's 524 WIOD or 655 WIOD in the Palm Beaches. The opinions expressed by the guest hosts or callers are not necessarily those of the station. Now, Stan Major on News Talk Radio 610 WIOD.
All right, we're back, and Chuck Meyer is in the studio with me, and I certainly thank him for sticking around after doing his full shift this afternoon. How are you holding up under the pressure?
Not bad, not bad. This is, read a lot about this case, but it's nice to talk about it with people from time to time.
Absolutely. And Jim Mars on the line from Dallas, Texas, author of Crossfire, which has been quoted as being the definitive work on the Kennedy assassination. How does that make you feel, Jim?
Well, I tell you, I just got through listening to your newscast, and I thought it was great. You need to keep that soundbite from the prosecutor in Dallas who explained why it took so long to indict the head of Sunbelt Savings and Loan. He said something to the effect of, when everybody at the top is involved, you have to get across the dead bodies of the middle management before you can do anything. You need to keep that, and when people call in and ask, why is it taking us so long to figure out what happened to President Kennedy, just run that soundbite for them.
You got it. All right, let's continue with the calls for Jim, for Chuck. We have the mobile line. Our new mobile line is available. That's Star IOD. And let's go to Ferdinand in Miami.
Hello, Mr. Mars.
Hello.
Yes, I'm a 14-year-old student of the assassination. I've been studying it for about 2.5 years now. And recently I was reading in High Treason, and contrary to popular belief, there are many more films on the assassination than the Zapruder film. One of those films was taken by Beverly Oliver, alias the Babushka Lady. I wanted to know if you know the status of any of those films, if they'd be made public anytime soon.
Well, her film, which undoubtedly would have been even a much better film than the Zapruder film, which was shot from the north side of Elm,
facing the grassy
knoll. Hers was shot from the south side and was shot up the street, would have shown the school book depository in the background, and then would have shown the grassy knoll and the picket fence area at the time of the shooting. According to Beverly Oliver, who, by the way, was a good friend of Jack Ruby's and knew all of his employees and worked at the nearby Colony Club, she said when she went back to work a few days after the assassination that there were some FBI men waiting there, and they said, we understood you took film in Dealey Plaza, and we want to process it, and we'll make a copy for evidence, and we'll give you the film back. And, being patriotic, she said fine, and she handed over her film, and it's never been seen since.
Has that been made? Has that been seen by any other film besides the U.S. government up to now?
The U.S. government disclaims that they ever got it. They claim they don't have it, and they don't know what happened to it. And nobody has seen Beverly Oliver's film, as far as I know.
I wonder if J. Edgar Hoover ever saw it.
I suspect he probably did, but we'll never know.
If they were FBI agents who took it.
That's another good question, huh?
That is a very good question. I would say, though, that she was shown some photographs in later years by assassination researchers of various FBI agents, and I won't give the name of the fellow she picked, but she picked a FBI agent who was very heavily involved in the Kennedy assassination investigation and said that was one of the men who took her film.
I know the name. Why won't you say it?
Another point I wanted to make was, at first, when the Zapruder film was first given to the Time Life building, didn't it become a little bit more cloudier, or as if to say, it wasn't as focused when it was shown to the public for the first time? Because that was a brand new camera that he was using. I mean, you see the enhanced version, and you really can't see the expressions on the president's face, the reaction by Jackie or any other person. Was the film altered in any way?
There is still controversy over that. First off, though, I will say that at the time that Jim Garrison, the district attorney in New Orleans, subpoenaed the film, Time Life fought the subpoena, and they went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, no, sorry, that's a legitimate subpoena, and you have to turn it over. So the copy that they turned over to Jim Garrison, by all accounts, was a several generation, somewhat blurry, not too good copy. I will say, though, that now, thanks to the work of a lot of people, and particularly Robert Groden, who is one of the co-authors of High Treason, that a much better, clearer copy of the Zapruder film is now available. Now, as to your question of whether or not it had been doctored, there's still controversy over that. Some very knowledgeable people say, no, I don't believe it has, and I find it very hard to understand how it could be. On the other hand, David Lifton managed to secure a CIA document that showed that the film was in the hands of the National Photographic Institute, a CIA-connected group, the night of the assassination, and that the original and 3 copies were made, which is the exact same number that turned up in Dallas the next day. So there's another group of researchers who believe that you cannot put total and unalterable faith in the Zapruder film, since there was the opportunity for there to be some work done on it.
Mr. Mars, I have another question for you. In the photo section of your book, I noticed one of the pictures that had, Lee Harvey Oswald in death in his coffin. Now, according to Frank Sturgis, that is the real Lee Harvey Oswald, as if to say there was an Oswald double, the body switch, and then the original Lee Harvey Oswald was placed back in the coffin. Do you agree with that remark?
You'd have to read my section on was Oswald really Oswald. I will tell you what the best theory to date is, and there's still some problems all along here. Of course, the idea that the Oswald in Dallas was not the real Lee Harvey Oswald has been advanced for a number of years, particularly by the British intelligence-connected author Michael Eddowes. To the best of what we've been able to put together, it appears to have happened something like this. The real Oswald, probably with his cooperation, helped in creating a substitute Oswald who went to Russia, okay? And the substitute Oswald, who was on a mission which had apparently nothing to do with the assassination, then returned from Russia and continued to use Lee Harvey Oswald's identity. Keep in mind, this is supported by the 1960 memo from J. Edgar Hoover to the Security Division of the State Department, which warned that someone was using Lee Harvey Oswald's passport. In other words, someone was impersonating Lee Harvey Oswald. This also explains why that Marina Oswald, his wife, has always had trouble understanding this phony Oswald idea, because the man she met in Russia is the same man that was in Dallas, and that's the only one she ever saw or knew as Lee Harvey Oswald.
What happened to the real Oswald then, Jim?
That's a good question, but we're beginning to
Well,
find
wouldn't it
out
be some
more
if he popped up someplace sometime?
There are several instances now, including some information coming out of California, that Oswald was seen and was active in Florida, perhaps, at the time of the Bay of Pigs invasion, and that he may have been in California in early '62. And, of course, this was a time when he was in Russia. So you say, that seems to present a real quandary until you consider the idea that the man in Russia was not the real Lee Harvey Oswald, which means the real Lee Harvey Oswald may very well have been operating around in the United States.
It also explains why he got back into this country so easily.
Exactly.
With incredible ease. And imagine what that kind of information would present to intelligence agents who might conceivably have tried to put together a frame-up of Lee Harvey Oswald.
Exactly.
They probably knew about it from day one. And we pointed out on the last show, Jim, that Lee Harvey Oswald defected to the Soviet Union at precisely the same time that the United States government had a program in place, operated out of North Carolina, I believe, where some training took place first, which was intended to send a number of Americans, most of them servicemen, recently discharged, into the Soviet Union on intelligence missions.
That's right. That brings us to the story of Otto Otepka, who was an official with the State Department and was in security, and in fact had been put in charge of a program to try to determine which of the defectors from the United States to Russia might have been actually U.S. intelligence agents. And he was trying to figure that out in the summer of 1963 when all of a sudden he was shut down, transferred, his safe was drilled open, and all of his material was taken out. A very unusual and very suspicious circumstance. And what it leads, of course, is to the belief that someone very high in the government wanted to get rid of all of this evidence that Oswald may have actually been operating as a U.S. intelligence agent. But if that's the case, then it's even more significant that it took place prior to the assassination.
Yes, it is. I'd like to ask the caller, you're 14. How did you get involved in your research on the Kennedy assassination?
Well, a teacher of mine, Mr. Jerry Barnett, he was an assassination freak, and he really got me into it. One day I was watching a movie called The Man Who Saw Tomorrow, and it was Nostradamus making predictions about the past, present, and future. And I saw the section on, John F. Kennedy, and it was, it compelled me so much on how accurately he predicted it. According to him, he said, the guilty one hiding in the misty woods. The misty woods, of course, being the grassy knoll.
Mm-hmm.
And, it was just...
He also said an innocent being charged with the crime would be killed.
Therefore, being dead, the innocent will be charged. Exactly. And, ever since any material I can get my hands on, I've been on it, and it's just a shocking subject to me.
I think you ought to write Chuck Meyer a letter.
Ferdinand, we'll give you a reading list, okay, that you can read for the rest of the summer. And I just wanted to point out real quickly that when Kennedy was killed, I was 12 years old, right about the same time you got interested in this case. So keep at it. I think it'll be a civics lesson that you might not learn in class.
Yeah, I plan on writing my thesis in college about that.
Excellent.
Right. Maybe you'll come up with an answer.
Okay.
Good luck.
Thank you.
Incredible, huh?
Chuck, Stan, there is the hope of this whole sordid mess. It's not us, it's the younger generation. If they can come up and understand and mature and begin to open their eyes and their ears and quit blindly following authority, there's the hope.
Hey, let's hope that Ferdinand heard about the trading cards.
Right.
He ought to get a hold of it.
Well, it's great because I've always said you can't tell a player without a program, and maybe that's the program.
Well, I'll tell you, as mind-boggling as all this information is to somebody at my age now, when I first interviewed Penn Jones, and he started hitting me with all these names, and all the people that he had interviewed and talked to, and we're talking about the late 1960s already.
Early 1960s.
And all the people that had mysteriously died and were no longer alive who could give testimony. And then I think of all the things that have gone down since that time. I don't know how anybody can keep track of it. I think you would have to have a computer. And a pretty damn good computer, and to start put all this information in and keep it all. I don't know how you do it. How do you keep all of this in your mind? Because we can bring up names right and left, and you can respond to it. And I guess this is your life.
Well, let me point out again that I was trained as a journalist. I still consider myself a journalist. Unfortunately, there's not many journals around, but basically, I don't feel like I'm on a crusade. I don't feel like I'm some kind of researcher. I feel like I'm doing my job.
Story without a deadline.
Right.
If it is true, however, and this is the tough question, if it is true, however, that there was a conspiracy to change the government in this country in 1963, and if people have met untoward ends because they were in some way too close to the center of the conspiracy, why haven't some of the researchers been knocked off for getting too close to the truth?
Well, let's not forget Lou Staples. Did you ever know Lou?
No, I'm not familiar. I'm not familiar with Lou.
Talk show host in Dallas. and he was very heavy into the Kennedy assassination and would quite frequently have programs related to that, and did quite well, and finally was wooed away from Dallas and was by a radio station in Oklahoma City. Went up there and was doing quite well. By accounts of his family, he had some big business things going on, was doing just great, and he was found shot in the head lying out in a field, and a gun near his right hand. The problem was he was left-handed, and there was absolutely no motivation for him to kill himself, and most of the researchers consider Lou Staples to be one of the mysterious deaths.
And Dorothy Kilgallen.
In the 70s.
There was Dorothy Kilgallen, and there was also the newspaper reporter, I think, who was killed in a rather strange episode in Long Beach, California. In a police,
Bill Hunter.
Yes, in a police station. And he had some great Ruby connections and Ruby stories shortly after the assassination.
He was one of the few reporters that was actually in Ruby's apartment.
Was there a Kilgallen diary, and if so, what happened to it?
I would direct your listeners to a very good book called Kilgallen by a fellow named Lee Israel, who was her biographer. And he looked into it in great detail, her death, and he became quite convinced that she was murdered. And he also points out that she was keeping a secret file on the Kennedy assassination, and in fact had told, and if Hubert Humphrey had been vice president, John F. Kennedy would not have been killed. And they said, well, who are you talking about? And he said, the current president of the United States. And of course, at that time, he was talking about Lyndon Johnson. Another interesting thing about this tape is that Ruby, who as I'm sure you know, was Jewish, refers to the infamous Dreyfus case and said, this is another Dreyfus case, only this time it will not have a happy ending. And of course, the Dreyfus case was a very famous historical case where the French military and government railroaded an innocent Jew by the name of Alfred Dreyfus and sent him to Devil's Island as being a spy, and it took 20 years for his family to finally get him exonerated and prove that he had been set up by the government who had used false evidence to convict him. And I find that just incredibly, that's just incredible to me that Jack Ruby, number one, would know about the Dreyfus case and would refer to himself in that context.
Yeah, Jack Ruby, I think, could have said a lot more, and I think if there was any great regret of the assassination researchers looking back, his interview in his jail cell with Earl Warren and Gerald Ford was one of the great travesties of justice in this century.
Absolutely. He pleaded to be taken out of Dallas. He said, if you'll take me to Washington, I think I can put it all together for you. He said, but my life is not worth a plug nickel here. Please get me out of Dallas. And Gerald Ford and Earl Warren says, well, we have to go to lunch.
Yeah. Yeah. And while we're on that particular subject, David Ferry telling Jim Garrison's investigators when the word came out that there would be arrests in the Kennedy case, he said, you know what this makes me now? It makes me a dead man. And David Ferry turned up dead real quick, too.
Exactly. In fact, what's really astounding to me at this stage of the game, having researched this since the day it happened, is looking back, you find that the principals, the people actually directly involved, if you'll take their statements of that weekend, most of them all tried to tell the truth. Lee Harvey Oswald said, I didn't shoot anybody, I'm just a patsy. His wife, Marina, said, Lee Goodman, he don't shoot anybody. His mother, Marguerite, said, my son is an agent of the United States government. Jack Ruby said, there's a big conspiracy going on right now, and the public has a right to know, and I'm being set up. Even District Attorney Henry Wade in Dallas was quoted in the Dallas papers the day after the assassination as saying, we have evidence that there was a big conspiracy, and I will not rest until every single person involved is brought to justice.
You know who shut him up right away? It was LBJ.
Exactly. And
he has said as
much. He said he got a call from Lyndon Johnson's office the afternoon of the assassination and was told not to say anything about conspiracy, whether or not he found evidence of one. Now, that's just, that goes beyond trying to settle the public. That gets into covering up a crime.
You were going to mention something about a memo that Ruby had written. This is some new information.
Oh, well, I was talking about this on the phone with Jim the other day, and I should let Jim do the honors, but this is the story that you have just uncovered, Jim, regarding the woman in Houston at the hotel desk.
Oh, yeah, what a fascinating story. I should point out to your listeners that, unfortunately, there's really no way to absolutely substantiate this story, but I have talked to this woman myself, and I find her to be a highly credible witness, and the main thing is I found her, and she did not find me or seek publicity, and she has absolutely no reason to lie about this story. Her basic story is that she was the telephone operator at the hotel in Houston where John Connally was staying on Wednesday night prior to the assassination, when the presidential party was staying overnight in Houston. And she said that Houston, on that Wednesday evening, she got a telephone call from a man who said, I want to talk to John Connally, and she said, as was their policy, they were not to acknowledge that he was there. She said, well, we don't have anybody by that name registered here. And he said, well, I know he's there, and I've got to leave him a message. It's very, very important. And he said, can I leave a message? And she said, okay. And he said, tell him if I don't see him tonight, I'll see him in Dallas. And she said, in your name? And the caller said, Jack Ruby. And she said, that's Ruby, R-U-B-Y? He said, that's right, Jack Ruby. And then the Monday after the assassination, the FBI and federal authorities swarmed all over that hotel and specifically asked her if there'd been any messages for John Connally, and she said, yes, this one. And when they went to the file drawer where they kept copies of their messages, naturally enough, the message was missing. And so it's been missing all this time, and that's simply her story. And since the message is missing, there's no way to really substantiate the story, but she said this is what she's told people all these years, and as she's told me, she said, what possible reason would I have to tell you such a story, except it happens to be the truth. So, now we're talking about a conspiracy that might have been much more in-depth and much broader than even some of the most ardent assassination researchers would even care to think about.
Yeah, this boggles your mind. You start to think about this.
Well, in the first hour before you joined us, Jim, we had a call about from a guy who was asking, gee, what about Ruby? And without trying to give him the short shrift, I said, well, I think, a lot of what Ruby did was quite clear. He was buttonholed by the mob to perform a hit for them. But, the more we think about it, I think Jack Ruby knew of the plot. It doesn't seem as though he would be high enough up to know of the plot, but he was certainly a part of it. He knew, and the more I'm thinking about it, I think he knew about it in advance of the president being shot.
Don't you think that he had to be made available to be in Dallas?
Well, let me point out two things real quick. First off, Jack Ruby was in contact, both personally and in telephone contact, with people who were connected to some of the highest organized crime figures in this country in the weeks and months prior to the assassination. And in fact, studying his phone records shows that as the date of the assassination approached, these calls increased to the number of something like 100 a month. I mean, he was frantically and touching bases all across the country. That's number one. Number two, I can assure you that Jack Ruby was a much more well-known and well-connected man in Dallas than we have been led to believe. He was not just some obscure nightclub owner.
Oh, no question, yeah.
Yeah, he knew everybody in Dallas, and everybody in Dallas knew him, okay? Now, let me, back to this Houston thing, here's another great one for you. Just recently, an FBI document has become available. I don't have a copy, but I have seen a copy, okay, from one of the Texas researchers, and it states that George Bush of Houston informed the FBI and warned them that Kennedy was to be killed in Houston on November the 20th, 1963.
Well, I have heard that George Bush supposedly supplied information after the assassination to the U.S. government, and there was a flap about whether or not it was the real George Bush, and
the CIA, of course, denied that it was President Bush.
Right.
However, they failed to come up with which George Bush it was.
So let me get this straight. FBI document says a Mr. George Bush of Houston says that the president's going to be assassinated in Houston.
Right.
And George was a businessman back then, right? He was in
the oil business in Houston.
Yeah. And I want to point out for listeners that...
and by the way, Charles Harrelson, in a fairly recent interview in jail, and he's not in Texas anymore, by the way. He's in a federal institution, and the name escapes me right now, but it's up in the Midwest somewhere. He said, he made a very cryptic comment. After denying that he had anything to do with it and had been in Dallas, he said, I'm surprised that they didn't shoot him coming out of the Rice Hotel in Houston.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Well, getting back to the Fletcher Prouty angle.
Okay, can we pick up on that? We've got to take a break. I'm about 10 minutes late on the break, but this is also fascinating. All right, we will continue with Chuck Meyer here in the studio and with our guest from Dallas in just a moment on News Talk Radio 610 WIOD. Okay, Jim, are you on the line?
I'm here.
Okay, Jim Mars, author of Crossfire. In our last discussion, did I mention the Robert Depew story about the plastic cover on the cartridge that ostensibly was mailed to him from somebody in Dallas a couple days after the assassination?
No, that's a new one on me.
Okay, let me tell the story real fast because it's one of those stories that you hear about, and it's the kind of thing that it would take a lot of imagination to make up. Therefore, I do give some credence to it. Depew told me on the air in Kansas City back in '66, I believe, in a discussion about the Kennedy assassination that a couple of days after November 22nd, 1963, he received from one of his members, anonymously, unsigned, in an envelope, a kind of a piece of plastic. And the note that was included in it, and it was the postmark was Dallas, was Bob, I picked this up at Dealey Plaza a couple of hours after the assassination. I thought it might interest you. And he put two and two together and thought that it was the kind of thing that could be used to use better ammunition in an older rifle and make ammunition that would fit into a rifle. Now, I don't know anything about guns. I don't know anything about ammunition.
Let me explain that to you because that is incredible, and it supports an issue that I brought up in my book, Crossfire, that I have not heard anybody else bring up. And it ties into some evidence that I have, okay?
And by the way, let me just finish the story by telling you when his home was raided some months later, when they were after him and they ended up chasing him and finding him in New Mexico and arresting him and sending him to jail for some other trumped-up charges, I believe, just trying to get rid of Bob Depew, leader of the Minutemen, and putting him behind bars. That was the only thing that ended up missing. In other words, all of his possessions were returned to him that were taken out of the house by the alcohol and firearms people, but he never saw that particular thing again. This plastic cartridge.
It's a sabot.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or they also call it an accelerator.
Mm-hmm.
And let me explain briefly what that is because I think it's highly significant. Because keep in mind that one of the things the Warren Commission used to substantiate their claim that Oswald had fired the shots was the fact that they said they found bullet fragments in the presidential limousine that had ballistics that could be traced to the Mannlicher 6.5 millimeter Mannlicher Carcano rifle, which was pretty heavy evidence, you know. Now, the thing is, here's the way it works. Without going into a complicated explanation that only gun enthusiasts would understand, let me just tell you how this could work. You take the Mannlicher Carcano rifle, which by all accounts had just been wrapped in a blanket and left in the garage for weeks and months. Out there in Dallas, anybody could have gotten hold of it. You take the Mannlicher Carcano rifle and you fire a 6.5 millimeter bullet through it into a bucket of water, and you recover the intact slug that has rifling that traces it to the 6.5 Mannlicher Carcano rifle. The intact slug would look absolutely pristine, exactly like Commission Exhibit 399, the magic bullet that was found at Parkland Hospital. You take that slug and you can seed it into a 30-06 shell casing using a plastic sabot or accelerator. Okay? This way you have a smaller caliber bullet fired from a larger caliber rifle, which gives it greater velocity, greater striking power, greater accuracy, and the beauty of the whole thing is that when you recover that bullet or pieces of it from your victim, the ballistics do not trace back to the .30-06, but instead trace back to the 6.5 Mannlicher Carcano. Is there evidence that that happened? You just presented one piece of evidence that a sabot, a piece of plastic, was found in Dealey Plaza. I have, and other researchers here have talked with a man in Dallas whose father was working on the air conditioning on top of the Dallas County Records Building, which is catty-cornered to the Texas School Book Depository in 1975. And lo and behold, up under the lip of the roof, he finds a .30-06 shell casing with it's heavily weathered on one side, indicating it's been lying there for several years, and it has a very strange crimp around the neck, indicating that it very well may have held one of these sabots or accelerators. Now, after I wrote about that in Crossfire to add to this story, I got a letter from a gentleman who had been editor of Guns Magazine, and he sent me a copy of a page from a February 1962 edition of Guns Magazine that advertised what they called a husk bullet, and it was a plastic sleeve to fire a smaller caliber slug through a larger caliber rifle, and that, of course, is a explanation of the bullet fragments.
Well, I must tell you that as recently as a year ago, off the air, he wouldn't go on the air with me again, but off the air in my home, I had Bob Depew retell me that story so I could reinforce my memory on it. He still contends to this day that that did happen. And he still contends to this day that not one of his members was involved, but one of his members did go down to Dealey Plaza just to look over the scene after the assassination and picked up this piece of plastic, which apparently nobody had picked up, thought was insignificant or something, and mailed it to him. So,
why would he tell you a story like that unless it happened to be the truth?
It's not the kind of thing. That's true. It's just like I say. It's not the kind of thing that you make up. There's no reason to make up a story like this. He has his own theories on who did it.
Right.
And of course, being the arch anti-communist that he has been, you know where those theories would lead. But he's a very interesting guy. Let's go back to some more phone calls and get as many people. We've had people here holding on the phone for about an hour and a half. So let's go to Jeff in Boynton.
Stan.
Yeah.
Great show. I could listen to this show night after night. And I wrote down a couple questions I had while I was sitting here. And I'll go through them. One of them was I wanted to ask Jim, the attitude in Texas, is it still the popular belief that the Warren Commission reports are facts, or is there enough knowledge in the state? Because I know your state's unique with this situation. Have they come around to understand that there is a cover-up?
To try to answer you, I guess I'd have to say that the attitude in Texas, while changing as it is in the rest of the nation, is still, to a large extent, pretty much what it was in Dallas in 1963. You've got a small percentage of the population that doesn't know anything. You've got a pretty wide cross-section of the population that suspects something is really wrong going on, but they really don't know what because they're not being told anything by their news media. And then you've got a small percentage of people at the very top of the social structure who pretty well wink and nod at each other, and they know that something's gone on, but they look the other way and they prefer not to talk about it. Now, in Dallas today, if any of your listeners go and visit Dallas, I would first encourage them to go to the 6th floor museum, which is on the 6th floor of what used to be the School Book Depository. It's now the Dallas County Annex, and they can see a very nice, very well-constructed museum that is an homage to the Warren Commission report. Of course, it was built by money from the Dallas Historical Society, which is made up of wealthy Dallasites. Now, after they've seen that, I would encourage them to go down the block, go a few blocks into the West End, and visit the JFK Assassination Information Center, which has been opened as a counterbalance to the 6th floor, and it presents you with a wealth of assassination conspiracy information.
Okay, I will remember that. I wanted to ask, the next thing I noticed, Alan Dulles, his name hasn't, is it Dulles or Dulles?
Dulles, D-U-L-L-E-S.
Okay. His name hasn't come up very much, but I think the evidence seems to point that he's quite deeply involved in all of it.
Well, I think that history is going to take a hard look at Alan Dulles, who, of course, was the longtime director of the CIA during the time of the Bay of Pigs, and then was subsequently fired as director of the CIA by John Kennedy, who felt like he had been led astray by the CIA because of the Bay of Pigs. And Dulles, of course, then ended up as a member of the Warren Commission determining what happened to JFK. Now, to add fuel to that, also fired with Dulles was his deputy, General Charles Cabell, who just coincidentally, if it is a coincidence, happened to be the brother of Dallas Mayor Earl Cabell, who was mayor of Dallas the day Kennedy was killed and helped arrange the motorcade route and the security.
Yeah, those are just lovely little details that just don't seem to be popularized. They don't seem to be reported. You have
Right.
to go
The news media can't seem to find that out, even though those are not just theories and suppositions. That is known fact.
And incidentally, on the very first day of the meeting of the Warren Commission, Alan Dulles handed out a pamphlet to all members indicating that all political assassinations in the United States during our history were by lone gunmen acting for selfish means only, and they were not conspiracy. So that set the tone.
And it makes you want to throw up, at least it does me. I want to ask, you probably know the term, the heart attack drug that, let's speak frankly, the one, shellfish toxin, that's what the CIA uses to kill the people.
Gives you a heart attack and really leaves no discernible evidence.
Okay, shellfish, what? I just wanted to write it down.
Toxin,
that's right.
You're not thinking of using that, are you?
No, I'm just...
Well, if you need to, that's a good one to use.
Well, when you discuss it,
I ate some shellfish down in Acapulco, and it sure made me ill.
Well, when you discuss it, it's nice to use the proper term rather than that heart attack drug. But that was one of the questions I had. My next one is Miltier. How far does the information... How far does that trace back Miltier's involvement? Or was he just there observing? Was he just part of the plans and came down to watch Mr. Kennedy get it, and he was just there for his sick enjoyment? Is that what the line is, or is it more?
Well, you're asking me a question that, quite truthfully, I cannot answer you because, unfortunately, and despite the expenditure of several $1 million by the federal government, let me make a real definite point here. There still, to this very day, has not been any meaningful investigation of this crime. So, if there had been a real investigation, I think the answer to your questions may have come up, but we really don't know. Just for supposition, the story of Joseph Miltier, of course, is well documented. It's on tape. In fact, I even understand that the House Select Committee even had the actual tapes of him foretelling the Kennedy assassination prior to it happening. He also called the police informant that taped him, which, by the way, happened there in Miami, as probably you folks are already familiar with, and then called the informant from Dallas the day of the assassination and says, "I'm here." And now researchers, and of course his picture, there's a picture in my book of a man standing in the crowd as Kennedy passed by, who is a dead ringer for Joseph Miltier. To answer your question, I can't answer it with any certainty, but I suspect that, yes, he was just one of those observers. He knew what was going to happen. He went to see what was going on.
Could he have been the guy that stopped off at the bar in the small town of Louisiana on his way from Florida to Dallas, and the day before, and had talked openly in the bar on November 21st about the fact that Jack Kennedy was going to get shot in Dallas the next day?
Hey, your guess is as good as mine. That's entirely possible, but again, since there's never been any meaningful investigation, I don't think
what has happened to this
with
man?
any certainty.
Miltier died.
He died.
Yeah.
That's the end of that question.
Yeah.
Sorry, I wish
died.
I could give you some very definite answers, but that's the problem. There's never been an investigation. We don't know for sure what really happened.
Well, I've got two questions left. One was about a new investigation. What the heck? Is there any plans? Is there anybody out there willing to stand up and say, let's do it and do it right?
Is there anybody up there willing to balance the budget?
I follow your logic.
But to would not make light of your question. This came up at a monthly meeting we have down here of people who have taken my course and assassination researchers who meet in the Dallas-Fort Worth area and compare notes. And this came up during that meeting, and we all kind of decided that what would really be neat, since it was a Texas crime, and since the Texas legal system was never allowed to go through the legal and normal channels, the body was, and the evidence was whisked out of Dallas quite illegally and taken to Washington and put under firm control of the federal government, and that began the controversies. I think, or we decided, that what might be really interesting is for a citizens committee to be formed, made up of knowledgeable and credible assassination researchers from all across the country who would sift through evidence and find where the legitimate evidence lies, and then as they came up with evidence which possibly could be used for indictments, to go through the Texas Attorney General's office and or a grand jury, and in other words, let our legal system work the way it's supposed to work.
I particularly like that idea, since the federal government seems to have taken control and now runs the levers. I see there's a potential maybe Dallas can take it because of their jurisdiction.
That's right.
And do it in spite of the federal government. But then again, the attitude that you tell me about Dallas and some of the political powers there, I can see how hard and
You'll find some politician that wants to be governor.
Yeah.
Or a United States senator. Needs to make a name for himself. I've got to move on.
Okay.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, Stan.
Thank you. We will take a break and be right back with Jim Mars, Chuck Myers, and the Stan Major program on News Talk Radio 610 WIOD.
Stan Major on News Talk Radio 610 WIOD.
And let's go to Dave in Coral Springs, who's been hanging on for about 5 hours. Dave. Don't tell me he hung up. Incredible. I figured he'd be on the line after all that time. Bill.
Yes, Mr. Major, Mr. Meyer, Mr. Mars. Is he there?
Hello, I'm here.
Yes, sir. I appreciate your book very much. It was excellent.
Thank you.
Probably one of the more definitive works on the assassination that I've ever read.
Thank you again.
The interesting thing about your theory on the sabot round, are you aware how vicious those rounds are?
Oh, yes. When they strike, they literally explode. And, of course, that's exactly what we see in the Zapruder film.
Yeah, and what does the agency call it? Termination with prejudice?
Executive action.
Yeah, something like that.
That, by the way, became a very unpopular term in the years subsequent to that. I don't think they use it that much anymore.
Right. I think it said more than they wanted to say.
What did you think of Winter Kills?
Oh, the problem with that thing is that's kind of like, what did I think of DeLillo's book, Libre, I got into that. I enjoyed the writing. I was really fascinated with it, but I finally just had to set it down because he plainly labeled it as fiction, and he quite, openly acknowledged that he had made up a lot of things to make up this wonderful story, and I just said, wait a minute, I've got enough trouble keeping all the facts straight. I've got to set this fantasy stuff aside.
I'm reading it right now, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, truth is stranger than fiction.
The thing, you've had almost close to a 3-hour discussion now, and Mr. Mars touched on this initially when he first came on the line. But I think one example of, the proper context to look at the Kennedy assassination is 26 years after the fact. The purpose of a coup d'etat is to achieve power over the country that the coup d'etat is conducted in.
Mm-hmm. And what use is the coup d'etat if nobody knows it happened?
Isn't that the best kind?
Well, it's a subtle thing. You can't have everybody understand it happens, because then there's a hue and a cry to correct it. But what you have to do is, starting from the top, different levels of the society, you have to let them be aware that there's a shift in power, so they'll understand who's in power. And that's been taking place, and now it's just getting down to us folks to talk about it.
But with our form of government, the kind of coup that took place is really the only logical coup that we can have. We don't have the military forming ranks around the White House.
Right.
Yeah, I think Lyndon Johnson and Richard Milhouse Nixon certainly got the message. I think they knew what was going on.
Oh, absolutely. So did Earl Warren. Earl Warren said it is not proper for a member, the ranking member of the judiciary, to serve under the executive branch because Johnson funded and founded the Warren Commission. He said this is not proper and this is a political thing and I'm not going to do it. And Lyndon Johnson called him into his office and reminded him that he had been a military man during World War I and said if you don't go and chair that commission and find that Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone assassin and there was no conspiracy, it could lead to war and you would have the lives of 60 million Americans on your conscience. And Earl Warren left Johnson's office with tears in his eyes and then phoned in his performance for the Warren Commission.
Well, see, all of this is a fait accompli, but I think there's a basic dysfunction in American society today that you can trace directly back to the events that happened in November of that year.
I agree.
And that's why we have Hubble telescopes that need a contact lens. And we have B-2 bombers that don't work.
That's right.
And stealth bombers that you'll see on radar.
And you know what's really great?
Well, we're spending billions on a bomber that we can't see. Hey, it's up there, though.
Look at the fanatical anti-communism. Pick out whoever you wanted to pick out as to who killed Kennedy. The anti-communism of the mafia, the anti-communism of the oil barons in Dallas, the anti-communism of the CIA, the Cuban exiles, the Pentagon yahoos. Look at their anti-communism. It's what has driven us. Now look what's happening to communism around the world. It's fragmented. It's reformist. It arguably can be made, the statement can be made, there's more reform in Eastern Europe today than there is in Washington, D.C. We're going to become the next power that's so solidified we can't get things done. And that's another legacy of 1963. Whatever it did, whatever the coup did, it didn't work. Because 25 years later, communism is crumbling by itself. Had nothing to do with communism is crumbling by itself. Had nothing to do with our military buildup, no matter what Ronald Reagan tells you.
In the 60s and 70s, we fought a 10-year anti-communist war, which we lost and didn't accomplish a damn thing other than wrecking our economy and killing 58,000 Americans. And in the 80s, we ran up a $2 trillion bill, arming ourselves against the evil empire, which is now crumbling before our very eyes. Obviously, we've been led astray.
Sir, I'm sorry. I'm just out of time. I appreciate your call. Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you very much. I want to apologize to Bill and John and Linda and Don. We just don't have the time. Jim, I think you ought to give Robert Depew a call for your next book.
I think I should, too. I think his story fits in perfectly with mine.
Yes. And, again, we appreciate you spending time from Dallas and discussing this.
Can I make one quick point here, just for food for thought for you and your listeners? You know, I think the people that planned the assassination and the people back in the early 60s, I don't think they ever realized that coming into the 1990s would be this society of people with access to copying machines, to VCRs, and copying machines that would blow pictures up, and the photographic progress that we've had. I don't think they ever realized that the average citizen would be able to pick over their crime to the extent that we've been able to do so.
Chuck, quick, reading list.
Okay, here's the reading list. Naturally, Crossfire by Jim Mars, and Jim says it's coming out soon in softcover. You may save a couple of dollars. High Treason, a recent book, Robert Groden and Harrison Livingstone. The Mob Did It books, Mafia Kingfish by John Davis, Contract on America by David Scheim. Virtually all these books still easily available in the bookstores. Conspiracy by Anthony Summers, very good book. You might go back to The Plot to Kill the President. That's the G. Robert Blakey book. He was the chief counsel for the Assassinations Committee in the late 70s. David Lifton's Best Evidence. All these books still available. And let's mention the Jim Garrison book on the trail of the assassins, also in the past 2 years. That should get you started.
Anything else quickly, Jim?
Well, just question authority and get out there and think for yourselves. Don't just listen to whoever's on the media.
Okay, thank you very much, Jim. Thank you, Chuck. We'll see you a week from tonight.